I am Nicholas Burns. I am the president of the board of the Church Club. We're very pleased to have the Reverend Patrick S. Cheng address us tonight. Before introducing Patrick, I just want to mention on May 3rd, we have our annual dinner. Our guest will be the Bishop of Dover, the Right Reverend Rose Hudson Wilkin, and people who are members will be getting a formal invitation in the upcoming weeks, and that will be in the air. That is our big event for this spring semester, as I like to think of it. I am a professor at NYU. I'm an English professor, and I'm very pleased that we're getting into this LGBTQ material in the Church Club. We're getting into queer theory and queer studies. That is something I'm proud to say we've been doing in English departments for decades, but it's nice to see the Episcopal Church catch up, and we have nobody better to guide us here than Patrick Cheng. Patrick is associate priest here at this very imposing Anglo-Catholic edifice we are in. He is a professor at the Episcopal Divinity School at Union. Of course, has migrated there from his former home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he was formerly associated with St. Thomas Church, and our board member, Rowan Brands, informs me that Father Patrick led a Zoom session, a regular Zoom session, under the auspices of St. Thomas during the pandemic that got 100 people, including from as far away as Hong Kong, and to faithfully conduct a Zoom seminar and get that many people is indeed an impressive achievement, both logistical and spiritual. Father Patrick is the author of 3 books: Radical Love, All on Queer Theology, Radical Love, From Sin to Amazing Grace, and Rainbow Theology. And he's written many more articles and papers and more than one could possibly list. It's a great privilege for us to welcome him tonight. Father Patrick.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, and thank you to the Church Club and all of you for coming out tonight in this rain, in this weather. Before I begin, just a quick sound check. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay, great. One of the advantages of being in the space that I serve is that I'm used to the sound system. So, but please feel free to raise your hand if you can't hear me. And hello to everybody that is live streaming in. It's good to see you too. Just a few hospitality things. If you need to use the restrooms, just go through those doors down, and there are restrooms to the right or all the way down the hall to the left. And just again, thank you to everyone from the little church around the corner, and just Father John David Van Doren, director, for hosting this. So, so let's get started. I'm really pleased to see all of you and to be talking about queer Anglicanism, 5 centuries of LGBTQ plus history. I thought we'd start with a prayer. I really like the For the Human Family prayer in the BCP on page 815, so I invite you to say it together or silently, but let us pray. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Great, so let me just talk a little bit about our goal tonight, where our destination is. So as I put in the title, we're going to look at 500 years of history, in particular Anglican LGBTQ history, and so that's why I put up the Cliff's Notes, those of you that are familiar with this. Obviously we can only hit the high points and the important stuff, but it is sort of ambitious. But the other thing I want to do is to make sure that you don't get all lost in sort of the details. And so I do want to make sure that I summarize the key points at the end. So I think one of the wonderful things about all of you today, there are folks, I'm sure, who are steeped in ecclesiology, and others who don't even know what ecclesiology is, or and so I'm going to try to sort of hit the middle ground, but if this seems overwhelming to you, or if there are questions, we'll have a good Q&A session at the end. But also at the very end, I will recap everything, and in particular the last 50 years. So that's much more doable than 500 years. Okay, so just know that there may be things that are different and new, but we'll get a chance to answer questions as well as to summarize at the end. And then most importantly, the reason for this is to help you to engage with these issues, right? That's not me, but I thought, it's just amazing, right? That the LGBTQ issues have been such an important part of the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Communion in the last few decades. And yet so many of us don't even have the basic knowledge to actually not only, sort of debate or converse beyond just sort of, high-level talking points, but actually to even understand the history and to have sort of intelligent conversation. And so that's part of the goal here, to really just, give you the tools that you need so that you can engage with others on this issue. So, and then I was saying, I was hearing from folks too, that it's welcome, because so often, even with the church club, this is not something that probably has been done a lot or even very much at all before. And so part of it is just, it's an important part of our Episcopal Anglican history. And so here's the agenda. I think I'm going to shoot for about an hour. This may be a little less than an hour, and then we'll have Q&A, or it may be closer just in terms of my own talk. And so again, if you need to stretch your legs, whatever, I get it, don't worry about it. But the agenda is, I just want to talk a little bit about my social location. Nicholas, thank you for the wonderful introduction, but just also just a little bit more about why I'm interested in this topic. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about queer Anglicanism. What is queer Anglicanism, both on the queer side and the Anglican side? Third, I'd like to talk about the first few centuries, the first 4 centuries, 16th through the 19th, the English Reformation with Henry VIII, and then going into the British Empire, as well as the Anglo-Catholic, the Oxford movement tradition. And then sort of move into the 20th century, where things really start changing, especially in the middle of the 20th century, in terms of the Church of England, the Anglican Communion, the Episcopal Church, in terms of acceptance of LGBTQ people. Still a long ways to go. Then the 21st century, sort of Y2K, and Bishop Gene Robinson's consecration and Windsor Report and all that. And then at the end, as I said, I'll do a quick review of the last 50 years, just sort of high points that just sort of summarize all of this. And then open it up for questions at the end, okay? Does that sound okay? I'm tracking okay? See the heads nodding, good. Like I said, we'll have time for Q&A, and if there is something that, if there's a fire behind me or something, feel free to raise your hand, or even, if there's something that's really, challenging that I'm not explaining, you can wait until the end or just raise your hand. So, all right, good. So let's move ahead. So this is about me. This is me. Just wanted to point out a few things. So social location, it may be a little hard for you, those of you in the back, to see these. But, it's sort of, we're all made up, right? The you is in the middle. We have all our different identities, whether it's education or race, religion, culture, gender identity, income, sexual orientation, right? We all bring that to our thinking, our doing theology. And I'm certainly no exception. So I think it's important just to lay that on the table. And so one of the things I wanted to say is I am a first-generation immigrant. This is also me and my mom. In 1970, this was taken at Hong Kong airport right before we emigrated to the United States. So I was actually born in Hong Kong, which is, as you know, was a British colony until 1997. So I was born in the British Empire until it was turned over. And we left in 1970 to come to the West Coast, where I grew up until coming to the East Coast for college. So I am not quite a second generation, but I call myself a 1.9 generation because, came here pretty young. But I think that shapes my thinking and also just my interest in Anglicanism. And I am an Episcopal priest. I do serve here, as Nicholas said, as associate priest. This is the back of my head. I come to this diocese from the Diocese of Massachusetts, where I was ordained. And as a theologian, I did my work at Union Seminary. Some Union folks here, so welcome. Here we go. I had the real honor to work with Dr. James Cone. He was my doctoral advisor, the late Dr. Cone, who was the father of Black theology. And he really helped me not only model what it means to be a good theologian, but one thing he always said to me was that theology is a great way to channel your anger. And, I really, it's a healthy way to channel, we all have anger, right? And much better through theology than other things. And so that's just one thing that has always stuck with me. But he really encouraged my theological voice to come out. And I do teach now at EDS at Union. I taught at EDS when I was in Cambridge, visiting professor of Anglican studies there. And then finally, before I was a priest, I was a lawyer. I still am a lawyer, went to Harvard Law School, and I serve as a compliance officer at Church Pension Group during the week. So I juggle a lot of things, but that just sort of gives you a sense as to where I'm coming from. I'm also a spouse. My husband Michael just got his booster tonight, so that's why he's not here. I think he's dialing in, so hello, love you. So this year we'll have been together for 32 years. And so we met after my first year of law school, and so that's Michael on the left, and our dog Chartra, who is now 13. This was on the occasion of our civil marriage. So it's been a while now too. So, in terms of my own social location being openly gay, cisgender identity. And then these are the books that Nicholas had mentioned: Radical Love, sort of intro to queer theology; Sin to Amazing Grace, rethinking the language of sin, like the closet of sin, for example, for folks; and Rainbow Theology, thinking about race and sexuality and spirituality. And then the last thing is just, as much as we've made a lot of strides in this country, LGBTQ plus issues are still such an issue in Asia, and so it's sort of coming full circle. I have taught there, but also I've been honored that my books have been translated into Chinese, Japanese, and or Korean, and it's really important to have that voice out there too. So that's me. Let's move into what is queer Anglicanism. We have the Anglican rose, the compass, and sort of LGBTQ. So one of the iterations of the flag here. So what is queer Anglicanism, right? And so this is the working definition that I'm going to use. The history and contributions of same-sex attracted and gender-variant individuals in the Episcopal Church, the Church of England, and the wider Anglican community from the 16th century until today. So it's kind of a mouthful, but one of the things I wanted to point out is, as Nicholas said, like with queer theory, one of the things is the idea of lesbian, gay people, even homosexuals, right, is sort of a 19th century invention. And so to kind of talk about earlier sort of identities, it's almost, sort of an anachronism. And so in terms of, I use the term same-sex attracted and gender variant to just sort of refer to that. The professor John Boswell at Yale was a real groundbreaking professor in terms of religious studies and LGBTQ stuff. He was actually my Intro to Medieval Studies professor at Yale when I was an undergrad. He got a lot of criticism for using the term gay people, referring to the early church. So that's just one terminology thing. The other thing is that some of you might be saying, well, the church in England certainly goes back farther than the 16th century and the English Reformation. And that is true. For purposes of tonight, I think 500 years is enough, so we won't go back even more. But I think, in terms of the Church of England, just sort of breaking away from the Roman Church in the 16th century to today, that will be the focus. And maybe part two, we can look earlier and all that. So that's just some thinking about the term queer Anglicanism. And then just defining Anglican and defining queer. So one thing is that, maybe some of you don't need the explanation, but the Anglican Communion, as you can see, with the colored, colored regions on this map, is the third largest Christian communion globally, after the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches, and spanning 165 countries and 42 provinces. Some of you in the Episcopal Church may know of provinces as provinces within the Episcopal Church, but these are provinces, like the Episcopal Church is one province out of the 42. And then 85 million members. And then since 1784, which is when the first Episcopal Church bishop, Samuel Seabury, was consecrated. Because if you think about it, before the Episcopal Church had its own bishops, there was no Anglican Communion because it was all part of the Church of England, right? And so actually the formation of the Episcopal Church founded the Anglican Communion in the 18th century. So Anglican Communion is not that old, all right? And then, some of you may be familiar with how the Anglican Communion is organized. Just a few brief things about they're called the instruments of communion, right? The first is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the spiritual leader, first among equals in terms of the primates of these 42 provinces. There's also the Lambeth Conference. How many of you had followed Lambeth last summer? Some hands? Okay. Every 10 years or so, the bishops around the world gather at Lambeth Palace. This last one had been 14 years because of COVID. And we'll talk a lot about Lambeth, particularly Lambeth 1998. And what happened last summer. But that's one of the second instruments of communion. The third is the primates meeting. From time to time, the 42 primates and the Archbishop of Canterbury get together to talk about things. And the last one is called the Anglican Consultative Council, the ACC. And it is the only body on which it has non-bishops. And it really it was founded in the early 1970s, 1971, I think. And it's met 17 times. The last time was in Hong Kong. It will meet again the 18th session. Each province sends around 2 or 3 people spanning the different orders. Why I tell you this is that you may be hearing a lot about these instruments of communion, but the interesting thing is that there is no centralized authority in the Anglican Communion. So even though we have these 4 instruments of communion, they can't force any province to do anything, right? And so a lot of this relies on persuasion. And maybe this can help you understand why things have been such a mess over the last few decades. Because, it's not like you have, the Curia or the Vatican in terms, that's just not how Anglican polity works. I mean, you've got these conferences, you've got the Archbishop, but in large part, we rely on persuasion. And then this thing called bonds of affection. I kind of like this picture, but it's this term of art, right? And it's kind of interesting, right? We have friends ourselves, and you sort of have a falling out with a friend, and maybe then later on you'll get back together, or maybe something happens and you never get back together with them again. But it's the bonds of affection is an ecclesial term about what keeps the Anglican Communion together, and so which is a relational idea. So that is, let's see. And so I think that sort of helps you, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about that is it helps explain the recent tensions in the Anglican Communion. Not one body can just say, hey, this is how we're going to do it, right? A lot of stuff has to get hashed out. And even within the Episcopal Church, that's the case. And so that just sort of explains why these issues have been going on for decades. The other thing is I just wanted to define the term queer. Whenever I talk, this always comes up. For a long time, it's sort of like, well, queer has always been a bad word, growing up, so I hate this word or whatever. But then now it's much less of an issue. But I think the interesting thing is queer itself is multivalent, right? That like queer theory, it has different meanings. And so one meaning is an umbrella term. So a lot of people throw out queer like a sort of umbrella term for LGBTQ, IIAA, like all the different identities. Rather than saying that every time you want to say LGBTQ, IIAA, you just say queer, right? So that's one meaning of queer. It's like a shorthand. Another is reclaiming power. Those of you that may remember, I sort of I was sort of in college in late 80s, early 90s, Queer Nation, we're here, we're queer, get used to it, the kind of reclaiming the word, just as black, the word black was reclaimed in terms of being something negative to powerful. So that's another definition. Transgression, queer as something really owning the sense that something is strange and off, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing. That queer does try to shake things up, for example. That's another meaning of queer. Non-identity, this is like sort of that post-structuralist literary kind of theory that queer is a signifier that's sort of empty, so every time you try to nail it down, it sort of moves. So queer theory now even talks about things like time, temporality, talks about emotions and affect. So queerness is not just sexuality or even gender. It is something about the non-identity of words, which is ironic, right? That queer sometimes is used as identity now. And then finally, this is the one I really want to focus on, queer as non-binary, right? The whole idea is that so much of our world is in binaries, on versus off, black versus white, right? Male versus female, even gay versus straight. I think the world is much more gray, or in my case, yellow, like black theology and white theology. I was always like, well, where does Asian American theology fit, right? Or even, sort of gay and straight. Well, what about bisexuals, or sort of trans or non-binary folks, and even sort of, LGBT as between male and female. And so I think the non-binary notion of queer is important. And I wanted to show you this lovely 17th century print. It's a satirical print, or it's one of those anonymous political prints. Have any of you seen this before? Okay, so let me show you what this is. The middle figure is an Anglican bishop, right? And he's called Rattlehead. You can't really see, but he's like a Janus. Janus, a figure that has two different heads. His head is shaking. That's why he's called a rattlehead. So this is the rattlehead, and on the right side you have the round head, and that's the Roman friar, right? Like with the friars, you shave the head and all that. And so the round head is giving the Anglican bishop a crucifix, and here's the Roman church. And on the other side you have what's called the sound head, which is a Puritan, right? The Reformed person who's handing. Can you see what this is? What do you think this is? Not a crucifix, but a Bible, right? And so I assume this was done by a soundhead because the way this works. But you see how the critique of Anglicanism was that it tries to have it both ways, right? The Anglican bishop is like shaking the head, crucifix in one hand and Bible in the other. And to me, this is the ultimate in non-binariness, right? Like the Anglican Church was born out of a refusal to be either Protestant or Roman Catholic, right? And this is, you may have heard the word Anglican via media, right? The middle path, the middle road. On the one hand, you have the Protestant Reformed path. On the other, you have the Roman Catholic path. And the Anglican path really takes the middle ground. And so if you ever have had friends or family explain to you, well, what does the Episcopal Church or Anglicanism mean to you? If you haven't really thought about the via media, that's something I encourage you to reflect on. That's, I believe, our gift to the Christian wider tradition, that it is a fusion, it is a non-binary blend of Protestant and Roman Catholicism, both historically and theologically, right? So that's my argument, that Anglicanism is queer, right? If queer is non-binary and Anglicanism is sort of neither Protestant nor Roman, then Anglicanism is queer. So more on that later. So let me just pause there. Are you all tracking? I see smiles and nods, and okay. I just want to make sure that this is at an okay pace, right? So okay, all right. So third sort of topic: the 16th through the 19th centuries. So Henry VIII, as you know, split away from the Roman Catholic Church. And in 1534, he had his Act of Supremacy, which stated that the Church of England is now, he's the supreme head of that. And so now what I find interesting is that in that sense, I think the Church of England was born out of a dispute over sexuality, right? So we kind of say, oh, well, we're always having these disputes. Now, technically speaking, it was because he was not able to have a male heir, which is really important, right? But the fact that he had 6 wives, even after he did get Edward, means that sexuality had something to do with this, right? And so it was not just about annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and so on and so forth, but really in another way, why Anglicanism is queer is born out of debate or out of sexuality. And some of you may not know this, but the first civil sodomy law was actually passed under Henry VIII, the Buggery Act of 1533. And you may notice the date, 1533, is just 1 year before his Act of Supremacy in 1534. Why I mention this, so what did this act do? So the sodomy laws used to be ecclesiastical laws. So they were prosecuted under canon law, right? And so especially, priests and religious folks, they would get prosecuted. What Henry did was to remove the jurisdiction and make it a crime under state civil law, right, or state criminal law. And so what's really interesting is that he used this law. This is why I show you some of this monastery. Remember, Henry seized all the monasteries as part of the Reformation. He used the sodomy laws as a way to shut down a lot of the Roman monasteries and to take their wealth. So I point this out also that a lot of times you'll see through history that sodomy laws, there's usually these prosecutions have something else to do with it, not just what you would think in terms of sodomy itself. But in this case, going after the Roman Church and using this as a way for both economic reasons as well as ecclesial reasons.
What's that ruin?
I'm sorry?
What is that ruin?
Oh, so it's a ruin of one of the monasteries, in England. So, a lot of them were. So until the Oxford movement came, the religious orders sort of had died out in Anglicanism, and then they were back. So I'd also like to say that the Tudor monarchs, right? Like after Henry died, some of you may know English history, but things were kind of a mess. So he went from Roman Catholic to, I have the Bible here, right? The sort of the Reformed Protestant notion. Edward VI became king at age 9 and died at 15. His handlers basically came out with the first 2 books of Common Prayer, the second one being even more Protestant than the first one. After he died, Bloody Mary came in, threw everything 180 degrees, went back to Roman Catholicism, right? I mean, if you think about everything that happened within a 10-year period of time, I can't even imagine living there. They actually literally tore out altars and smashed the stained glass, and put it all in again. And then finally, Mary died and Elizabeth came in. And Elizabeth is known for the Elizabethan settlement, right? That the 1559 Book of Common Prayer is actually taking the 1552 Book of Common Prayer, which is known as the really Protestant book, but adding Catholic elements, right? So how, for example, how you receive the communion. It's kind of interesting even today, like in terms of the body of Christ and the bread of heaven, right? Have you ever wondered why the two are together? The body of Christ is much more Catholic. The bread of heaven is much more Protestant, right? Blood of Christ, cup of salvation. And so, sort of putting together some of these elements, there was a thing called the Black Rubric that said, by kneeling, we in no means sort of infer that Christ is present in the Eucharist. And so Elizabeth actually took that out. So the 1559 Book of Common Prayer is also non-binary, I think. It is very queer. And so again, it's sort of this Anglican via media of Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. But what's even more queer and non-binary is this. I don't know if you realize this. So Elizabeth I was actually seen as a very masculine monarch, and she never actually did have children. And so therefore she was succeeded by James VI in Scotland, James I in England, who was the King James Bible, the James of that. But there's this lovely Latin saying from their time that was very rude but funny, right? Rex fuit Elizabeth, nunc est regina Jacobus. So basically, Elizabeth was king, now James is queen. Okay. So it's not the King James Bible, it's the Queen James. No. What's really, a lot of people don't know is apparently James surrounded himself with very handsome young men in his court, and he would be very open in flirting with them, and apparently after he died, there was a secret passage between his bedroom and one of his, sort of palaces, and, where one of his favorites were. And, he was married and everything, but still, there was a lot of sort of gender fluidity, shall we say, both in terms of Elizabeth and James. And there's a really interesting article that some people have taken a look at Elizabeth's pictures as well as descriptions. And people who are into sort of the history of science have hypothesized that Elizabeth might have had, sort of traces of being intersex or something. I mean, just or her, sort of in terms of her chromosomes might not have been sort of, may have been variant. So I think just it's interesting, right? Going back to this time that Elizabeth and James had gender role differences. Another really interesting thing that I never knew about until I actually taught a class on queer Anglicanism like a year ago this spring at EDS at Union. One of the earliest pastoral care documents involving lesbians occurred in the 17th century. And you heard me right. So Jeremy Taylor was a bishop, a Caroline divine, known for his spiritual writings, following holy life. He wrote this letter called A Discourse on the Nature and Offices of Friendship, Letter on Friendship, to this poet named Catherine Phillips. And this is not really well known, but the letter was written in 1657. Catherine Phillips she had a pseudonym, Orinda, and Orinda had all these women friends that she had very close friendships with and wrote poems about and all that. And she was sort of known as, I think she married a husband that was decades older than she was, but it's thought that she was a lesbian. And she wrote to Bishop Taylor saying, how far can Christian friendship go, right? And so Bishop Taylor actually writes this whole discourse on friendship. And what's really interesting is that he doesn't shut it down, and it's very clear that he knows what's going on. So I encourage you, it's not necessarily easy to find this, but there's this whole text where he sort of knows what's going on. He says, yes, friendships can be very close. He even talks about Jonathan and David, right? The Hebrew Bible text about close friendships and all that. And so he never sort of comes out and says, don't even think about going past this line, but he definitely says that, something that is unseemly, you don't want to go past. But believe it or not, in the 17th century, you had a pastoral care letter involving sort of lesbian love, right? And an Anglican bishop. Not all the stuff was good, though. In 1640, there was the execution of John Atherton. He was the very first and only Anglican bishop to be hanged, to be executed for for sodomy. And so he was hung with his proctor, his assistant, John Child. But remember, like what I told you about the sodomy laws and shutting down the monasteries? He actually angered. He was a bishop in Ireland. And he spent a lot of his episcopacy trying to get lands back that had been taken away by the state. So he was kind of a pain, in terms of real estate. And so a lot of people thought that this was also used as a way to get back at him. Now, but it is interesting, right, that under the British sodomy laws, it was a capital punishment until the 19th century. So it sort of runs the gamut. I'll talk about the English Empire. I love Darth Vader, the Empire Strikes Back, I guess, the cathedral. But the British Empire, this is a map of the British Empire, its height. And, when you look at the Anglican Communion map, there's a lot of, similarities, right? And it's no surprise because empire depended on religion, and religion depended on empire to spread. And this is, I love this picture. It's an empire in which the sun never sets, right? The sun never sets on the English Empire. And so this is basically like a clock, right? You go through all the hours of the night, and it's always daytime somewhere in the British Empire, or the Anglican Communion, for that matter. And so another literary theory, not just queer studies, but post-colonial studies, right? A lot of post-colonial studies is about how power perpetuates itself by using and naming the racialized other, right? How you maintain power is to treat the other people as others, as less civilized, as exotic, right? All these stereotypes we have in people of color, right? Either sort of exotic Asians or people who aren't civilized, in Africa or South America, or, take a look at this. Some of you have seen, my talk on post-colonialism, but this is sort of from a map in the 19th century, and it shows Britannia, a woman, with a shield and a spear, sitting on top of the world. Alice is down here holding up the world, so Britannia is sitting on the world. And look at what she's surrounded by. She's surrounded by women of color, right? You have women of color holding up palm fronds that can, sort of help keep her cool. You have a peacock, you have an elephant with a tusk here, right? So I mean, if you think about racialized stereotypes, oftentimes they were used to perpetuate power in the colonies. And so that's something that we need to think about, even to this day. But what's also interesting is, and this is queer post-colonialism, that also the sexual other. If you think about how people have used sexualities to treat people as the others, Robert Aldrich is a historian who has written about colonialism and homosexuality. His book is wonderful. Look at this picture of the wrestlers. It's sort of, he writes, racialist and racist stereotypes abounded, romanticization and idealization of foreign cultures, or conversely, denigration of them were common, along with wild fantasies, homoerotic writing and art lauding the physical attributes of foreign men participating in race-based stereotyping, relations of power permeated colonial sexual culture. So not only is race used as a way of perpetuating power, the sexual other, by saying, oh, these people are perverse. They need civilization to help, organize them, right? And so, ironically, sort of, the British Empire was seen as a place where, young British men could sow their oats, right? They would come and it would be a sexual playground for them. But they actually passed some of the harshest sodomy laws in the British Empire. And this wonderful study, British Colonialism and the Criminalization of Homosexuality, says that of all the colonial powers, the British sodomy laws were the most strict. Like the French, weren't nearly as much. And when you look at this map, these are the remaining cultures that actually have harsh penal, penalties. After the recent Supreme Court cases, who knows? I hope we don't go backwards. But a lot of it also is coexistent with British colonialism and the sodomy laws from that time. The other big 19th century thing is ritualism, right? This church, this Anglo-Catholic, it's so easy for us to think now that the Episcopal Church, Anglo-Catholicism, of course it's like part of it, right? But it's hard to remember that before the 19th century, the Anglican Church, Communion, the Church of England was much more Protestant, right? There were debates in the Episcopal Church in going to the 1870s as to whether you should have candles on the altar. And whether you should bow to the altar. I mean, this was in General Convention, right? And so look at this picture. Do you see what the priest is holding up? He's holding up a pig's head. This is a satire of Anglo-Catholicism, that the altar has been turned into a dinner table. You can see bottles of wine and meat here. It's almost a parody of the body and blood of Christ, right? And so instead of having a third bowl, you have this is a wine bottle with smoke coming out, and And so, it's sort of making fun of this almost as being, paganism, right? And so the 19th century, I point this out is because there's such a connection between Anglo-Catholicism and gay male culture. And I'm fascinated by that. I've served mostly, if not exclusively, in Anglo-Catholic parishes. I'd love to do a book project on that sort of connection. I have my theories, But I think what's really interesting was that the church would use Anglo-Catholicism and masculinity, the critique of Anglo-Catholicism, saying it was feminizing the church as a way to try to not get the Anglo-Catholic movement to come into force. You understand what I'm saying? They were saying, you're feminizing the church. And so look at this. I love these cartoons, right? The priest here is shocked to see, these are women, right? A girl and a woman wearing a chasuble, right? The ritual movement. Now, for us, women priests, right? Women acolytes, not a big deal. But the whole point was my goodness, if you go to doing chasubles that look like dresses, pretty soon you're going to have women serving on the altar, right? So this was a critique of Anglo-Catholicism using masculinity. Another one here, it's called The Height of Fashion. And the person is saying, oh, Athanasia, it's charmingly becoming. And so you can see, it's almost like the priest is wearing a dress, right? Looking in the mirror, like, look at me, like, how beautiful is this? And so it's kind of interesting that even in the 19th century, there's that awareness of that connection between same-sex attraction, particularly between men in Anglo-Catholicism. And then John Henry Newman, some of you may know this, right? He's founder of the Oxford movement, became Roman Catholic, became a Roman Catholic cardinal, recently became sainted. A lot of you may not know, but he was actually buried with his friend, Father Ambrose St. John. They were buried not next to each other, but in the same grave. And John Henry Newman's last testament was, I wish with all my heart to be buried in Father Ambrose St. John's grave, and I give this as my imperative will. So John Henry Newman, in the Roman Church, like when you have sainthood, they exhume your body, and in terms of the just remains, and I don't know, they never went with where Father Ambrose St. John was, but so I think there's a lot hidden there that people don't talk about. Then the 20th century, now we're getting sort of into, as I mentioned before, the 20th century is when things start changing a little bit, right? There are little pockets that I've mentioned. I bet most of you, is this all new for most of you, like the stuff that we've covered? I mean, some stuff you might have known, others, but I want to point out this book, Homosexuality and the Western Christian Tradition, by Derek Sherwin-Bailey. This is probably the most influential book that ushered in queer studies, religious studies, queer theology. Derek Sherwin-Bailey was a canon, a priest. No reason to think he wasn't straight, but he was very interested in the theology of marriage. But he did this study on homosexuality in the Western Christian tradition because he was involved with the decriminalization of homosexuality. So in the 1950s, right, there was the whole trend to, strike sodomy laws off the books in England. And he concluded that a lot of these texts that were used for anti-gay purposes, like Sodom and Gomorrah, he argued that they were misreadings of the Bible. This is like in 1955. And in fact, the great John Boswell, as I referred to earlier, relied a lot on Bailey's scholarship when Boswell was doing his book. And the Wolfenden report, this was the report that recommended that sodomy laws be stricken from that homosexual behavior between consenting adults in private should no longer be considered a criminal offense, right? There was actually an Anglo-Catholic priest serving on the commission. They recommended this in 1957. It took 10 years before the Sexual Offenses Act actually abolished, criminalization of same-sex acts or consensual acts. But it did happen, and the religious part was actually really important. Some of you may know this phrase, text of terror. Phyllis Tribble sort of used this as anti-women texts in the Hebrew Bible, but these texts of terror, like the Sodom and Gomorrah passage, Bailey had argued that really, if you look at the Hebrew word yada, which also means to know, you look at Ezekiel, it should be argued that Sodom and Gomorrah is really about inhospitality, right? Less about that than condemning same-sex acts. Or maybe condemning that you offer up your daughters to strange people to be raped. Maybe that's not such a good thing either, right? So re-examining not just that, but Leviticus, 1 Corinthians, Romans. There was a lot of that started in the 1950s. It's not a new thing. And then in the 1960s, you actually had, clergy allies. This group called the Council on Religion and the Homosexual was founded in 1964 through Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco. And the cleric in the sweater was an Episcopal priest, Robert Cromie. And they did a fundraiser that was a drag ball. And it actually got, police came and raided it. And this was several years before Stonewall. And actually that did a lot in terms of educating sort of the clergy as to sort of the plight, but seriously, just in terms of, that was an important moment, right, of religion. So religion is not always inconsistent, even going back to the 60s with LGBT issues. William Stringfellow, some of you may know. How many know William Stringfellow? Is that name? He was actually in the Diocese of New York. He was a lay theologian, one of the great 20th century lay theologians. He was a graduate of Harvard Law School. He could have done anything, but he decided to open up a storefront practice in Harlem. And the great theologian Karl Barth actually at a conference told everyone to listen to William Stringfellow. He thought of himself as a biblical theologian, not so much like as a fundamentalist, but he really took seriously the critique of economic injustice in his theologies. And he lived all his life with his partner, Anthony Town. And he has a beautiful book on when Anthony Town died and the grief that came, with losing a loved one. So, when I was discerning the call to priesthood, the rector of my church at that time said, you really should read Stringfellow. And I was grateful for Roger Furlan for doing that. Malcolm Boyd, some of you may know. Malcolm Boyd was called the Espresso Priest. He wrote his book, Are You Running With Me, Jesus, in 1965. And he came out in the 70s, but in that book he had this poem called This is a Homosexual Bar, Jesus, right? Like this was a book of prayers for, everyone, and, that sort of stirred things up. This picture of Michael and me, Malcolm Boyd got an honorary degree from Episcopal Divinity School in 2014, the year before he died. So it was a real honor to sort of meet him at that time. But he went to Union, he did work in the 50s, and so also in the 60s, so there was a lot of that going on too. Moving to the 70s, Integrity, some of you may know, is sort of defunct now, but it was really the LGBT, or mostly LGBT group at that time, in terms of working for the full inclusion of all the baptized in all the sacraments, Episcopal Church, founded by Louis Crew Clay, who died in 2019. Louis Crew actually wrote my recommendation to be an Episcopal priest, and so I'll always be grateful for him. I knew him, from before, but this is a picture of me with him in the 2015 General Convention in Salt Lake City. But he did so much in terms of, the reason why he founded Integrity was he had gone to San Francisco, he called up Grace Cathedral to ask if there was a group of, for LGBT people at Grace Cathedral, right, in San Francisco. This was in the early 70s. And you know what his reaction was from the person on the phone? They laughed at him. And they laughed and they put the phone off, and he could hear them like laughing, the whole people, like, this guy wants to know about this. And he was like, if in San Francisco at Grace Cathedral, we can't even have a group of people, I need to do something about this. And that's why he founded Integrity. Also in the 70s, the Philadelphia 11, this was sort of women retired women deacons. Women could become deacons, but General Convention did not pass sort of a resolution authorizing women priests. So on July 29th, 1974, 11 women were irregularly ordained priests called the Philadelphia 11. And also in 1976, you may not know this, but this is the first positive LGBT resolution of General Convention. I mentioned General Convention, some of you may or may not. That's like our governing body, right? It's like Congress. You have two houses, the House of Deputies, like the House of Representatives, and you have the House of Bishops, like the Senate. But in 1976, General Convention said, it is the sense of this General Convention that homosexual persons are children of God who have a full and equal claim with all other persons upon the love, acceptance, and pastoral concern and care of the church. I mean, it sounds kind of today, but if you think about it, you may think about it yourself, going back to 76 for the Episcopal Church to officially pass something like that. That was an important time. Ellen Barrett was the first lesbian, first woman, first LGBTQ person openly to become ordained a priest in the Episcopal Church. This happened on January 10th, 1977. Ellen Barrett now is a member of a religious order. She's on Facebook. She's now Sister Helena Barrett. She lives in Scotland. And I hadn't realized we actually shared January 10th as an ordination date. But she was ordained in this diocese. She was ordained by Paul Moore, who in his autobiography, Take a Bishop Like Me, it's just amazing the hate mail he got for ordaining Ellen Barrett. But what was interesting was that Bishop Moore, about 6 years after he died, his daughter wrote a book called The Bishop's Daughter.
which kind of revealed that after his death, apparently he had a lover going back for decades that showed up after the funeral. But what was troubling was the lover was someone that he had counseled, who was an undergraduate at Columbia, who went to see the bishop, in the close at that time. And then subsequently, after his death, in 2018, a lot had come out about Paul Moore, having abusive patterns with seminarians and priests in the diocese. And so the Episcopal Diocese in New York has named this. So Paul Moore has done great things and has also done awful things. And so it's really important to also name this. So it's sort of really, secrets are not good things. And so, I just mentioned that sort of an interesting connection with Paul Moore. And then the first not so great resolution from General Convention was in 1979. We believe it is not appropriate for this church to ordain a practicing homosexual or any person who is engaged in heterosexual relations outside of marriage. This was a direct, reaction to Ellen Barrett's ordination. I still, I'm not sure practicing homosexual. What, do you practice enough that you're so good you're not practicing? No, but anyway, so for a long time, this was sort of the General Convention resolution. And then we'll come back to that. But Pauli Murray, as some of you know, Pauli Murray Studies has really come to fruition. Pauli Murray was the first African-American woman to be an Episcopal priest. But she was just amazing. She was a civil rights lawyer. She kind of came up with a lot of the theories behind Brown versus Board and also women's equality. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, before she died, actually did an interview with Time magazine attributing some of the thinking to Pauli Murray. She had a lifelong partner, Renee Barlow, who after Renee died, she said that when she put her hand on Renee's coffin, she got a jolt of electricity, and that's when she found her vocation to become an Episcopal priest. And that's when she entered the process in the Diocese of Massachusetts. And so she was a late vocation. But there's been a lot of interesting things. Not only was she partners with Renee, there's writings that she wanted to get hormone therapy. It's thought, she referred to herself as a she, that's why I honor that use of a pronoun. But it's thought that, in terms of either transgender or non-binary, Pauli Murray was very open about this. And so some of you may know that have connections to Yale University, that Yale, had 12 colleges for the longest time. They had 2 new colleges, one for Benjamin Franklin, the other for Pauli Murray. And this is the seal for Murray College. And I was really taken by the fact, I read the history behind the seal. The seal is designed to honor her non-binariness. That you see how there's a light, and it's almost like Taoism, right? The dark and the light. But they said that with the dark and the light sitting within the light and the dark is sort of an honor of not just sort of gender identity, but all the ways in which Pauli Murray sort of broke binaries and other borders. So just a really powerful sort of honoring, and Dr. Murray went to General, and so another really great part of LGBTQ Episcopal history. So we're getting there. Let me just do a quick time check. We're still okay, right? Yeah, okay. So 1980s, HIV/AIDS obviously is something that is a real issue for the church. Robert Williams was actually the first gay man to be ordained to the priesthood. Was ordained in 1989, so some 12 years after first ordination. And so remember, there was a 1979 reaction to Ellen Barrett, but Robert Williams, Bishop Spong in Newark, actually, Maverick Bishop, ordained him, and apparently it was a big deal, right? And he had a huge Anglo-Catholic ordination thing. Wrote this wonderful book, Just As I Am, in 1992. I don't know if some of you remember, if you on Christopher Street in the Village, right? When you got to Hudson Street near St. Luke in the Fields, that's where I sort of found the Episcopal Church in my call to ordination or vocation. There used to be like a furniture store with a window, and there was a newspaper clipping, right, of Robert Williams, and I just had not realized this. It's no longer there. I think it's a pizza shop or something like that. But what happened was his thing was such a big deal that he started talking to the press be careful not to talk to the press too much. And so they asked him questions about monogamy and celibacy, and he just kind of went on and actually said something about Mother Teresa, and it just, the proverbial whatever hit the fan. And so he was actually asked to leave the priesthood by Bishop Spong, and he did leave. And then shortly thereafter, in '92, he actually died of HIV/AIDS. There was actually a New York Times article, ouster of a gay priest, who betrayed whom? So query whether it was really about, presumably the issues he talked about, or whether it was still controversial. But, this is for Bishop Spong, who died in 2021. So just, another history. And then Carter Hayward, who was a former professor at the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, in the 1980s, wrote a very important book, Touching Our Strength, which was basically, I would say, the first lesbian theology, all right? And what makes it lesbian feminist theology is that she argued that God was not so much up there or above us or, against us, but God is in between us. So whenever you interact with someone, when you love someone, she said God is eros. So when you interact with someone, that connection that you feel, that's where God is, right? And she said that God is not a noun, God is a verb. So, we God to each other. Some of you may be, oh, this is great. Others may be like, this is the most heretical thing I heard. But she really, Union doctoral grad, really changed her thinking about theology and continues to publish today. 1990s, why do I have a medieval sort of heresy thing? Because there was a heresy trial in the Episcopal Church in the 1990s. How many of you remember or know about the Ryder trial? Yeah, not a lot of people? Okay. Yeah, so basically this is how I learned about the Episcopal Church in the 90s. I read about this heresy trial. It was good news, right? I mean, that at the end, Bishop Ryder, who was brought up for heresy charges by 10 of his fellow bishops, actually was, sort of absolved from this, acquitted. And so I read this, I was like, I have to check out this Episcopal Church thing. But he was actually put on trial for ordaining a gay deacon. Now, the gay deacon, his name is Barry Stoffel, who wrote a book, Courage to Love. Remember Bishop Spong? The thinking is that they weren't really after Walter Ryder. Walter Ryder served as assisting bishop to Bishop Spong. But Spong had such a big personality that no one wanted to go after him. So they went after Ryder, right, who had served as the bishop of Iowa before. And, he has written a book himself on just how hard it was for him after he was retired to go through this whole ecclesiastical trial. But there's this great opinion that, so believe it or not, heresy courts exist and they issue opinions, like in civil courts, saying that actually, even though convention said that you weren't supposed to ordain a practicing homosexual or whatever, that there's no violation of core doctrine, that homosexuality is not a core doctrine. What is a core doctrine? It's something like the Nicene Creed, right? If you deny the Trinity or something like that. What's also interesting is after Louis Crew died, this used to appear on Crew's website. You cannot find this opinion, at least as of a few months ago, anywhere on the web. I had to actually write the archives of the Episcopal Church and pay like 50 cents a page or something to get this opinion. So I have it if any of you are interested. But it's stuff like that actually should be out there, right? This is the court of bishops saying, no, it's okay to ordain someone who's openly gay because it does not violate core doctrine. So, but when was this? This was in '96, right? Not that long ago. And then 1998. So, if anything, remember I was saying like stuff that you should remember. Remember the 1998 Lambeth conference, right? Archbishop Carey, Queen Elizabeth. This was a real turning point. This was a really awful point, and I sort of bring in my own story. I was sort of really feeling called to the Episcopal priesthood, started some discernment. But the 98th Lambeth Conference came out with an awful resolution, Resolution 110. And there was a famous sort of interaction between a bishop and sort of a gay activist deacon in the Church of England, where the bishop was trying to exorcise the deacon at Lambeth, right, because he was gay. In my own case, after the resolution came out saying that gay people should not be ordained. At that point, I had already been with Michael for almost 10 years, and I thought, well, if that's the stance, I probably shouldn't continue with this, and I didn't. And so for people who think that these things don't matter, they do matter, and it took decades until I sort of decided to go back into the process. But the resolution, and I realize some of you are far back, it's kind of hard to read. You can find this elsewhere, but the high points here is that the resolution says that marriage is between a man and a woman in lifelong union, that abstinence is right for those who are not called to marriage. Reminder, remember Lambeth, the four sort of instruments of communion? This is all the bishops in the world coming together every 10 years. So marriage, man and woman, abstinence is not called to marriage. Rejecting homosexual practice as incompatible with Scripture, and then cannot advise the legitimizing or blessing of same-sex unions, nor ordaining those involved in same-gender unions. All right, so basically at this global conference of Anglican bishops, they passed this resolution, which was not even supposed to be passed in the first place, and it was on the books. Now remember, it's not binding. Remember what I said earlier about sort of Anglican instruments, but resolutions do have force. And in terms of sort of, and continue to have force. And so this was actually a very important part. And some of you may remember after this how hurt people were. And a lot of the bishops, had done the pastoral letters sorts. Yeah.
Was that the one where Gene Robinson was excluded, or was that a later?
No, this was actually 10 years later. I'll get to this. So the question was, is this where Gene Robinson, after he was consecrated, was excluded? So even 10 years after this was just saying you shouldn't be ordained, you shouldn't have same-sex unions, right? And ironically, some of you may know these are priests, Lane Lynn and Renee Hill and Horace Griffin. These are priests of color whose voices emerged after Lambeth, because a lot of the bishops of color, 2/3 world bishops, were the ones against LGBT. And a lot of my own work is sort of this dichotomy between race and sexuality is a false one, right? But so often those two things are pitted together, whereas that's not the real issue in my view. And so getting to the 21st century, we're almost to this day in terms of Bishop Robinson and his then spouse and Y2K. The 2000 General Convention, this is another really interesting resolution. This is the first time the General Convention actually acknowledges any kind of relationship other than marriage. So remember, General Convention is the Episcopal Church, the U.S. Church, along with other jurisdictions that are outside the U.S. that are part of the church, not Lambeth, right? So Lambeth, that was the awful 110 thing. In this one, it says that we acknowledge that there are currently couples who are living in other lifelong committed relationships. So this resolution actually says reality is you have couples that are living in lifelong committed relationships. If they're characterized by fidelity, monogamy, mutual affection, respect, careful, honest communication, and the holy love which enables those in relationships to see in each other the image of God, then we denounce promiscuity, exploitation, abuse. So they have all this stuff, but the bottom line is that they acknowledge that even after Lambeth, there were, sort of relationships that were not marriage, but yet were holy, and you could see your partner in the image of God, in that relationship. And I think, and interesting, think back to Carter Hayward's theology about seeing God in the relationships, right? And I think to this day, I think this was really important as a sort of counter or reaction to the 98 Lambeth Conference. And so shortly thereafter, in 2003, Gene Robinson was consecrated bishop, and that was a huge deal, right? And that really created, close to, I think for many years people thought that schism for sure, right? The Anglican Communion would split. And the Windsor Report was sort of this commission that was put together as a response to the Robinson consecration. And they came out with this report in 2004. Again, small text, but basically, this is paragraph 134, right? But basically, this says that the Episcopal Church be invited to express its regret. I love this. This sounds very British, doesn't it? You're invited to express your regret. Basically, apologize for doing this, right? Okay. And then, pending such expression of regret, those who took part as consecrators should be invited to consider in all conscience whether they should withdraw themselves from representative functions in Anglican communion. Meaning that if you serve, in one of these bodies, you should consider whether you should withdraw yourself. Notice again, they have no force to say you're kicked off, but we strongly advise you to do this. And then the Episcopal Church be invited to effect a moratorium on the election and consent to the consecration of any candidate to the episcopate who was living in a same-gendered union until some new consensus in the Anglican communion emerges. And so this 2004 is a reaction to Gene Robinson, right? And then that was just consecrations. They also, paragraph 144 deals with same-sex blessings. It says, we call for a moratorium on all such public rights. This is not just marriage, this is same-sex blessings. Be invited to express regret, anyone who did one of these horrible things, to consider in all conscience whether they should withdraw themselves from representing functions of Anglican communion. So, so this was the mind of the communion in 2004, right? And then, on top of that, as part of appendix to the Windsor report, they proposed what's called the Anglican Covenant. And I love this flowchart here. This is a representation of the Anglican Covenant. Now, do you imagine, have you heard of it? Do you think it passed or failed? 50%. Well, okay, it failed. Right? But basically it failed because it was really complicated. They proposed they proposed this whole thing that you would have a two-tiered system of Anglican communion. So people who were bad, who did things that the communion didn't like, they would get moved to a lower tier, but they still wouldn't be, wouldn't leave the communion. And so it's just very complicated canon law and all that. And that had to be ratified by all of the provinces in the Anglican communion, right? But before we get to the ratification part, this is the 2008 Lambeth Conference. I love this picture. Bishop Robinson is standing in front of a sign saying, we welcome you to the 2008 Lambeth Conference, right? That he was like the one of two bishops that were not invited to Lambeth. The other was one of the breakaway, bishops. But he was expressly not invited. In fact, this film, how many of you have seen Love, Free, or Die? It's really powerful, right? I mean, it's taken from New Hampshire's motto, right? He's the New Hampshire bishop, live free or die. But Love, Free, or Die, there's this wonderful footage of his walking up to Canterbury Cathedral, I think, right? Trying to come into the gates and people stopping him, like not even for a worship service, saying, I'm sorry, sir, but don't make me sort of kick you out kind of thing. And then, but he went anyway, and he wasn't part of the official stuff, but he sort of did services, and there's a wonderful footage of people just screaming while he was sort of giving a talk and stuff. But this was sort of, he tried to go to Lambeth, and he was expressly disinvited. And so this also triggered decades, or more than a decade of Episcopal Church property litigation that has basically finally sort of ended, because in most cases, not all, the Episcopal Church, the national church did win, but there's a lot of sort of complicated stuff by that, but a lot of breakaway churches. Now maybe this was already planning, given women's ordination, the new prayer book in '79 of this, maybe it was just a culmination of things, not just the Robinson ordination, but in the 2010s, right, this is the Bishop Glasspool, right? So Mary Glasspool, so I guess, the Episcopal Church thought in 2010 that there was no longer much of an issue, and she was the first lesbian to be consecrated a bishop in the Episcopal Church for the Diocese of Los Angeles, and now she's assistant bishop in this diocese. And this is the Anglican Covenants defeated by the Church of England in 2012. I wrote Owens beating a dead horse, and I think I saw it still moving. The irony is that they sort of went through the whole communion, and the defeating province was the Church of England itself, right? Remember, there are 42 provinces? Well, the Church of England itself would not agree to the Anglican Covenant, and so it died. This was that very complicated twofold step. So, the attempt to impose more order on Anglicanism, canon lawyers may love this, but I think it is very un-Anglican, and I think the defeat of the Anglican Covenant shows that. And then General Convention actually had full sacramental marriage equality in 2015. It authorized dioceses to do that, and in 2018, 3 years later, made it mandatory. And so in the United States, anyway, and it first allowed it, I think, 2009, same-sex blessing rights. But, again, the primates meeting got so upset that in 2016 they imposed 3 years of quote-unquote consequences on the Episcopal Church So, yeah, but interestingly, it expired in 2019, and no one ever looked back to what the consequences were or whatever. Seriously, because one of my students last year were like, well, what happened to the consequences? Because this was such a big deal. And I think they just, in a very Anglican way, just let it lapse. So the 2020s, here we are today. Transgender and non-binary voices, Trans-Episcopal, the Organization for Trans Non-Binary Gender Variant Episcopalians, was founded in 2004, but has really come to full voice in recent years. I think just before convention, Trans-Episcopal folks went to Executive Council, which is the body that runs the Episcopal Church in between general conventions, do a presentation, know your pride flags, and to ask the church to actually live fully into LGBTQ plus inclusion, including trans and non-binary folk. In other institutions, like the Church Pension Fund for Black Group, for whom I work, have now changed gender designation fields to include non-binary and self-designation. It's an important issue for the church, right? And so that's something that's come to the fore. And also the intersectional and post-colonial voices that I talked about, right, from the 19th century. A lot of scholarship now deals with the intersections of theology and race and colonialism and sexuality. And so some of you may know Jarrell Robinson Brown is in Church of England priest. Myself, Carla Roland Guzman in this diocese, teaches at General, and Miguel Escobar, who's executive director of BDS, do theology in this area. Jarrell has written this book, Black, Gay, British, Christian, Queer. It's a really great book if you don't know about it. My Rainbow Theology also deals with intersections of sexuality and spirituality and queerness. Roland Guzman wrote the book Unmasking Latinx Ministry for Episcopalians. And Miguel Escobar's latest book is called The Unjust Steward, or his first book is on sort of economic justice, but also weaves in issues of sexuality and his own Latinx identity. So this is just an example of some of the scholarship that's happening. Some of the gap between the academy and theology, I think, is closing a bit. So I think there might be a new via media, right? Instead of Protestant versus Catholicism, new via media might be sort of a synthesis of race and sexuality and gender, sort of queer of color voices. And being an immigrant, being an Asian American person, I always hate sort of the trope that, on one hand you have these homophobic people of color, right, and then you have all this accepting, sort of European Americans. But there are a lot of queer people of color. Like, where do we fit? And so that binary needs to be deconstructed, right? So if you take queerness seriously, I think you need to sort of think about that, especially all throughout the Anglican community. Finally, just last year, just a couple months ago, the 2022 General Convention that was postponed a year because of COVID was in Baltimore. Now, integrity has sort of died out, I think, but the House of Deputies, for the first time, actually had enough LGBTQ identified deputies that they formed their own caucus. So instead of being an advocacy group needing something, they actually had their own caucus that organized and proposed legislation. Here's a list of stuff that was passed last summer. There was a task force that was passed affirming non-binary access and leadership, resources and training for welcoming and supporting trans and non-binary persons and families, supporting LGBTIQ refugees and asylum seekers, giving thanks for the ministry of Louis Krupp Clay, supporting LGBT people facing additional discrimination during COVID-19. So all the stuff. A task force to study household and relationship diversity. What kinds of different household configurations do we have today? And then finally, concerning the exclusion of same-sex spouses and bishops from Lambeth Conference. I'll get to that in a second. Some of you may realize that this past Lambeth Conference, unlike the 2008, openly gay bishops were welcome, but guess what? Their spouses were not. So more to come on this. But all of these things were passed by General Convention. So you might be like, well, why didn't I hear about it? I mean, most times people in the pews don't really hear about the great stuff that's done, but there is actually a resolution saying that we should develop resources and will be developed in terms of welcoming and supporting trans and non-binary persons and families. So this is what the Episcopal Church is doing, on a national level. Lambeth Conference, so you saw 1998, 2008, 14 years later, because of COVID, 2022. This is fascinating, right? This is one of the Eucharists. So there was the presence of openly LGBTQ bishops, right? And this is a big deal here, right? Like you saw Gene Robinson out there. I mean, this time, this is a quasi-official picture, right? Of 8 bishops, including Jeff Mello, who hadn't been, hadn't been consecrated yet. But you have Bishops Chamberlain, Glasspool, Gail Johnson, Bud Perry, Jeff Mello, Jerry Van, Thomas Brown, and Kevin Robertson that were there at Lambeth. And so progress, right? But not so great was that before the conference started, their spouses were actually disinvited. And some of you may have heard, about Bishop Glasspool saying how hurtful it was that she got a bit, even though she had met the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, he wrote a letter to her and her spouse saying, I'm sorry, but your spouse is not welcome. And it's a big deal because every other spouse is not only welcome, but they're paid for, right? And then they have tea with the Queen at Buckingham Palace, and it's all a big deal. And this is a Zoom meeting that sort of happened a little bit before, that you can see the smiling faces of some of these bishops, but it was to really talk about this issue. Like Thomas Brown, his spouse is actually an Episcopal priest, about sort of the exclusion. And a lot of them brought them anyway, right? So they weren't allowed to, apparently the spouses had Bible study or something like that. So they weren't allowed into the Bible study, but they brought them anyway, and they stayed off-site in the hotel. And then, quite frankly, a lot of bishops in the Episcopal Church, hung out with them in solidarity. But it shows you, this was last summer, right? Late July, August. The same-sex spouses of our bishops were not invited to Lambeth. And then, most of all, there was this thing called a Lambeth Calls controversy. This might be a little bit inside baseball, right? But since you guys are church club people and you're here, you clearly like inside baseball. But there was actually, Lambeth was billed as this nice thing where people would get together and you kind of build relationships and no divisive resolutions, right? Like what happened in 1998. Apparently what happened was the bishops all got there. They were issued these booklets called Lambeth Calls. And they opened them up, I think the Bishop of Los Angeles opened up, and there was a surprise proposal buried in the thing to reaffirm Lambeth 110. That's a 1998 resolution, right? From 32 years ago, or 34, as the mind of the communion. And so what's interesting, though, with social media now, right? I'm no longer on Twitter. I have excised myself, but at that time I was on Twitter. But it's just like, it just kind of blew up in a way that 1998 it didn't, because people just, there wasn't that real-time thing. But people were like, why? And apparently, initially, with Lambeth Calls, they could vote that they accept the call or that it requires more discernment, but there was not even a no option. So it was very strange, right? Nobody knew about this. Actually, to this day, nobody knows how this got slipped into here. So some of you may, but then there was such an uproar that they actually revised the language of Lambeth Calls. And, again, this, I won't read it, but the revised text is actually not too bad, and this is what passed. It says that there's disagreement in a plurality of views. This is the first time, right, that Lambeth has actually acknowledged a plurality of views, as certainly as legitimate, you'll see. They acknowledge that even 110 says, regardless of sexual orientation, all baptized, believing, faithful persons are full members of the body of Christ to be welcomed, cared for, and treated with respect. They say that a lot of provinces continue to affirm that you can't have same-gender marriage, can't bless that. But other provinces have blessed and welcomed same-sex union marriage after careful theological reflection and the process of reception. I mean, this may be like words for you, but to acknowledge that provinces have done careful theological reflection, that there are queer theologians, that we're not just pulling things out of nowhere, and a process of reception, and as bishops, we remain committed to listening and walking together. So Archbishop Welby actually wrote a letter to all the bishops before the vote, and this is what I'll end on, which is, it's actually a very important letter, right? He says that the call, he points out what I just pointed out, which is that provinces have blessed and welcomed same-sex union marriage after careful theological reflection, process of reception. And he says, in that way, the call states the reality of life in the community today. And there is no mention of sanctions or exclusion in 110-1998. So all of this exclusion stuff that happened, ironically, he says, look, 110 doesn't have them. It might be sort of a revisiting of that, but he said, there's much mention of pastoral care. We have a plurality of views. And apparently, like this was received not only the letter, but his own speech very well. And then what I'll say, the last thing about Lambeth is that there's actually a statement celebrating LGBTQ people. So this we've come so long from '98 where like people were in shock. After that call happened, someone said there was a statement from Anglican bishops and primates who are keen to affirm and celebrate LGBT plus people. I think it's a big deal, not just affirming people, but actually celebrating us. And it says that God is love, and that's why we believe that LGBT plus people are a precious part of God's creation, that we're fearfully and wonderfully made, and we are all are equally loved. These bishops and primates want to affirm the holiness of our love, listen to our stories, and understand our context, and never shy away from tackling discrimination and prejudice. And so it was signed by 12 archbishops, 164 bishops, and these primates, the head of the Scottish Episcopal Church, Bishop Curry, Archbishop of Brazil, Canada, and Wales. So this is sort of, and this was outside of the Lambeth process, so this is sort of one of the last words. And so I think, we're close to, time to be wrapping up, but this is what I promised you, so we've had a lot of stuff, right, we've got through a lot, and it's okay, but I'll just go through the last 50 years. These are the high points, and so take a deep breath and kind of like go through this, and this is what you probably need to know if you're going to debate or have conversations with others. To me, I think these are the high points. 74, the founding of integrity by Louis Crew, right? And I have a thumbs up or a thumbs down, now, meaning whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. Okay. So then 76 was that resolution, right, that actually said that homosexuals have full and equal claim to the love of the church and God. Ordination of Ellen Barrett, another thumbs up. So these should all be familiar to you. 79, not so much, no ordination of practicing homosexuals. And then the Ryder heresy trial, the trial itself was not great, but his acquittal was, right, in 1996. 1998 was the Lambeth Resolution 110, big thumbs down. 2000, General Convention Resolution that acknowledged relationships other than heterosexual marriage, thumbs up. Consecration of Jim Robinson, thumbs up. Windsor Report, remember, it's 150 paragraphs or something, thumbs down. Founding of Trans-Episcopal in 2004, thumbs up. General Convention permitting full marriage equality, thumbs up. And then finally, this Archbishop Welby's letter at the 2022 Lambeth Conference, acknowledging there's plurality of view, theological reflection, and no penalization, thumbs up. So I think that's sort of in a nutshell. And the future, I mean, we've gone over 500 years. Look around. I mean, we are the future of the Episcopal Church and Anglican Communion. And that's why I think this stuff is so important. I'm so happy that the Church Club is doing this, right? Because how else can you determine the future and talk about the future if you don't know your past? And as the final thing I'll say is a summary of the Cliff Notes, the most important stuff. One, Anglicanism is a non-binary tradition, right? Like when I talk about Protestant, Roman Catholicism, deconstructing binaries. Second, same-sex attracted and gender-variant individuals have been a part of Anglicanism since at least the 16th century, going back to King Elizabeth and Queen James, right? All right, and then much progress has been made since the mid-1970s in terms of LGBTQ acceptance in the Episcopal Church. And then finally, much more work remains, particularly with respect to acceptance of transgender and non-binary individuals. To me, that sort of sums up the 5 centuries. And so let me turn it over to questions now. So thank you. And thank you to Christina and all of those of you online. I'll put up a summary just as something to think about, but we have time for a couple minutes of questions, and then sure. Does that work? We're about 5 minutes to the hour, so let's see. Any questions that have come up? Clarification? As to, yes.
How was the Windsor report named?
Oh, right. So a lot of these reports are named where they were first met or convened. So I don't know if it's Windsor Castle or whatever, but that's the place, right? Yeah. But that's a really good question. Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the Queen endorsed it.
Yeah. Oh, the House of Windsor, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, but it's interesting. In hindsight, but it certainly was a big deal, and how the U.S. Church responded took up several general conventions. Yes?
This whole issue is sometimes presented as a division between North and South. How do you see it?
The question is, how do you see the North-South division, how it's divided? Yeah, and you know me, like this non-binary thing. I think the one between North and South is somewhat convenient, but not necessarily descriptive of reality. One of the best things that I've done is I've taught a seminary in Hong Kong, going back, and LGBTQ folk there, as well as people from China and Asia. I can speak from that. And I can tell you both the need and the existence of folks deconstructs that binary. So I actually think really, when we talk about the future, I think, really the bridge between what divides still remain are LGBTQ people of color, really that can help bring sort of the sides together, I think. Other questions? Yes?
I just want to say that I think I remember after the Windsor Report, there was a response from the Episcopal Church, and it was called To Put Our Hope in Christ. And it was wonderful. Step by step, they refuted everything from the Windsor Report, and then it just kind of disappeared. I haven't heard anything about it recently, but I
Yes.
wonder if you knew about it.
So to restate the question/comment, it's just the response to the Windsor Court was to put our hope in Christ. It was a wonderful report, also in paragraph functions, in many paragraphs, right? Ian Douglas actually was a co-respondent. Like there was even a commentary on that report. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's like two people from different ends of the theological spectrum debating it. The PDF of that still exists, so I don't think you even need to buy it. I think if you Google that, you can actually read it, but you're right, it's very thoughtful, and a lot of the General Convention resolutions that came out of it came out of the response, right? And so I don't really think it was cited as much as the Windsor Report, but I think, if you think about it, the consecration issue, not just ordination of deacons and priests, but consecration of bishops, I don't think that's a debate anymore in the Episcopal Church, nor is the same-sex marriage issue, right? I mean, sacramental marriage. But thank you for pointing that out, and maybe that's something that I should, put a picture of version 2.0. So, thank you. Others? Other questions? Yes.
What about the role of the internet itself? Because I vividly remember Louis Crew's webpage about the writer trial, and that was on the internet in 1996 when most churches didn't even have their own web pages, and it was occupying that episcopal space. So I have the internet and friend or foe.
Yeah.
We're able.
Yeah, so Nicholas's question you heard was just, has the internet been friend or foe? And thinking back to Louis' website, he had a whole page on the writer trial, right? And I think that's how I kind of found out about it. But I also remember Episcopal election, around that time with Bishop Sisk, I think. I had to actually walk to St. Luke in the Fields, even though I was sort of living in another part, because I had no way of figuring out how to get news about that, right? And today we can actually watch it real time. So I think in that sense, it does bring us all closer together. Yeah, the website, this is the dangers of the internet. I mean, it's a kind of different dangers than we talk about for historians, that after Louis Crew had his website on the Rutgers website, right, where he was a professor, it's been scrubbed. And so all that stuff doesn't exist anymore, and even the Internet Archive doesn't have everything. So all this wonderful stuff on his writer trial, including the opinion, I can't find, and it doesn't exist. And so when Twitter imploded, or in the process of imploding, same thing, right? Like we think that these things are going to last forever. So I know books don't last forever, but this is where I'm old-fashioned, right? Put in a sort of paper. But I think so. That's one danger. But I think I am so grateful for the digital world. Mastodon or wherever you are now. Really, I think the bonds of affection, are very much strengthened through digital means. Does that help, or is that just some reflections? Others may have different meanings. Yeah. Other reflections? Yes.
Following the trace of how a lot of these developments happened, one thing that I'm not sure if I'm seeing the pattern correctly, but it seems that most of the actual the big moments of progress, right, ordinations and consecrations, it doesn't seem like a single one of them. It seems like almost all of them were done in open defiance of whatever overseeing body did, right? Like, is it actually correct to observe that not a single one of these things waited for the episcopacy or the communion for permission first?
Right, good question. The question is just sort of all these consecrations, ordinations, were they done in defiance of the overseeing or larger body, if you will, right? Well, I think the short answer is most, but I would say the Robinson consecration was actually done in accordance with Episcopal Church rules. Now, again, this is going back to Lambeth, right? I think Lambeth 110 is interesting, but not binding officially on the Episcopal Church, right? So what was interesting was that to get the consents, I don't know if you know this, another sort of inside baseball, like after a bishop is elected by a diocese, you know, you've got to get a majority of the consents, right, of standing committees, and so they actually elected to do that consent process at General Convention that summer, under the theory that it would be a lot easier to make people accountable and to get the yeses as opposed to them sending in separately. So that was a strategic move. But that was all done canonically, right? But I think you also raised the point that you know what, Episcopalians are also very good at kind of having ambiguity in words. So even the ones that might have been done in defiance, you know, I think the people doing them thought, you know, whether that they were doing what they were called to do. But, is there a question from online?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I have
okay.
a question from Kevin.
Yeah,
He
hi, Kevin.
says, in terms of pastoral care and mental health support for LGBT plus people, what resources and standards have been outlined and recommended by the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Communion? Or if you know, where is a good place for us to find those resources?
Yeah. So let me just state back the question, just in terms of mental health, pastoral care, resources for LGBTQ folks and all folks, right? I mean, in the Episcopal Church, where can we find those, or you know, what's the state of that? You know, it's a good question. I think in many ways it's decentralized, and so the short answer is go talk to your parish, or you know, is not a great one. I will say things have changed as of this General Convention. I was in watching a few committee meetings. There is a movement to try to have a more centralized approach to mental health resources in the Episcopal Church, but I think that's something that still has a long ways to go. Others that are involved, are there those professionals in this area or otherwise? I think one of the things, frankly, from my perspective too, is just naming it. I think there still is so much shame, and you know, it shouldn't be, but just to even talk about it from the pulpit or the pews before we even talk about resources, right? But yeah.
Well, I was going to say that that's same within the field.
Yep.
For the past couple of years, we've had a support group for transgender, non-binary people. It's not professional; it's more of social, but it's also it's Friends of Shelley. It's been growing, and you know, it's been just really great. So, I mean, yes, there are places for people out there.
Right.
Getting the word out, obviously, is problematic sometimes.
Thank you. Yeah, the answer was like certain parishes like St. Luke in the Fields, you know, just having support groups, and they exist, but getting the word out. And you know, one of the interesting things on queer theory, I mean, not just to take it from the heart and move it to the brain, but you know, sort of the intersections between disability theology and theory and queer stuff. I mean, you know, sort of invisible disabilities, I think is really important, and I think that's something that needs to be named. But thank you, Kevin, for that really important question. I think a lot more needs to be done in that area, and also economic justice and some of the other things we talked about. Yes, question.
My name is Megan. I work with campus ministers,
Yes.
students and 20s, 30s groups, and I'm looking around this room, and I may not be familiar to everyone, but I recognize a lot of people, kind of newish. And you know, everybody doesn't have to raise their hand, but I think that, you know, like for instance, I remember when Integrity, there was, I guess I wondered actually if anybody could we ask for, could you raise your hand if you've been
so, you know, we've had Eucharist on the street, and it's not just, so this isn't really a question, and I'm so sorry. But like, I'm just so grateful, first of all, for you, maybe because it's the end, if everybody would just permit me to not be qualified to just thank you, and to thank everybody that's here and that's watching, and also to acknowledge, you know, tears and smiles through this whole presentation and what's to come.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for your work and ministries and just sort of in so many important areas that all too often, you know, the Episcopal Church does not recognize. Let me honor your question by saying, so is your question that people raising their hand, have they sort of been part of like Integrity Eucharist or Pride March, or is that what you're asking? Or
any kind of advocacy, and or if you're going to be after tonight.
Okay. Did you hear that? So like, there's an LGBT concerns group in the diocese, Integrity, other things. How many of you are either have done this or would like to do this, after tonight? Raise the hands. As in Anglican things, it's always optional, right? So, may, no, must. So a good show, but I would like to say, yeah. I mean, I have to say, like when I first, I grew up Roman Catholic and came to the Episcopal Church in the late '90s. I don't think I would have ever imagined, certainly in this parish or anywhere, to have a talk like this, or the fact that I would be giving one. So I think there's hope, but I still think there's a lot to go, right, in terms of, and I think we are a really well-kept secret. I'm just always shocked that people are so amazed that there is, so much progress within the Episcopal Church, and I hope that we will let that light shine. Yes?
I'm not sure if this is a quick question, but I just want to honor it that this person has asked online. This is from Susan. She says, what is the scriptural argument our Anglican bishops are citing to oppose LGBTQ plus equality? I think you touched on that a little bit in the...
Yeah, so Susan was asking what are the what are the biblical arguments, or was it just...
The scriptural arguments.
Yeah. I mean, I think a whole nother lecture could be done on sort of these texts of terror, right? So texts of terror, that's what I call that, yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there are sort of the Levitical and 1 Corinthians, and there's always, I do find though, like I've spent, this is, my first class at Union was actually Biblical Hebrew, because I was so tired of people telling me what the Bible said. I wanted to read it myself. And so after years of Hebrew and Greek and Latin, I can tell you that people are never going to agree. I feel like you can, but I think there are a lot of biblical debates, and there's also historical debates. But that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in queer history, right? That it is not true that this is a phenomenon that just arose in the last few decades, right? And one of the important things we can do is to uncover past historical practices. So happy to talk to other people. Yes?
I was just commended everyone the 1946 project.
The 1946 project? Okay.
It's a project spearheaded by Kathy Paul, who they make the point that the word homosexual was not ever used in the Bible until 1946 in the RS.
Oh, right.
It's a really important project.
Thank you. Yeah, the important project, the word homosexual. Yeah, I was saying before, right? Like if you look at it, like homosexual was coined like in Germany in the 1900s, and the Greek word arsenokoites and malakoi, right? That's in 1 Corinthians. Malakoi actually means soft, and arsenokoitoi means person in bed. And so, like, where they get homosexual out of that, now you could argue things, but some people have thought it actually means the top and the bottom, regardless of the gender of the people, right? But it just, but to say, oh, the Bible says this, is not true at all. Others, I think we're that's over. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. So, do you want to say anything? Yeah.
Well, I would just like to invite everyone, first to thank you on behalf of the Church Club, and also to invite everyone to a brief